Hi Year 10, welcome to Lesson 3 on Biomes. Today we're going to be working through a couple of different ways to value ecosystems, looking at some biodiversity, things like that. What you need to do is watch this video and pause it to take some notes on each slide. At the end of this video, I'll let you know what questions you need to complete on your Biomes worksheet, which you will complete on that Google Doc that we started last term. Once you have completed those questions, you need to let me know, and I will send you the sample answers so you can mark your work for today. When you've finished all that, you can keep working on your case study, and I'll remind you of all this at the end. So let's get started. So the first thing we're going to look at today is something called utility value. Now, anything in red, remember, is a definition, and you need to write that out word for word. Anything else, you can just write in dot points. So the utility value of an ecosystem is its ability to satisfy the economic wants of humans. It means that it has a monetary value. So we can place a monetary figure on an ecosystem. And as you remember from last term, we'll be looking at the Great Barrier Reef together in class. And here's some information around the utility value of the Great Barrier Reef. Now, Deloitte are an economist firm that value different assets, and the Great Barrier Reef was valued by them at $56 billion. So they said that the utility value of the Great Barrier Reef is $56 billion. Now, that is a lot of money, and that contributes to the domestic economy in Australia, as well as the global economy worldwide. It adds $6.4 billion to the Australian economy and creates 64,000 jobs. Now, this is all pre-COVID, okay? So post-COVID things are a little bit different, obviously, because we can't have the tourism. But this is what we can say the utility value of the Great Barrier Reef is. Now, for a bit of perspective, if you look at this image just down here, we can say the Great Barrier Reef supports 39,000 jobs directly within Australia. That means it directly employs 39,000 people, and the other jobs are indirect employment, and I'll talk about that in a moment. If we think about that in comparison to some other really large employers in Australia, Qantas is 26,000, Telstra is 33, Kmart is 30,000. So you can see the Great Barrier Reef actually employs a lot of people and is a really significant employer in the Australian economy. So we need to make sure we look after the Great Barrier Reef to make sure that we can continue to support those jobs. Now, like I said, those are 39,000 direct employment jobs. Those are people directly employed by the reef existing. Things like tour operators, hotels, things like that. We also have, 30-odd thousand indirect jobs. Things like people that supply hotels, the cleaners that are employed by hotels, the cafe suppliers for the hotels. There's lots of sort of flow-on jobs that are also created because the Great Barrier Reef exists. So this is just one of the reasons why we say it's important to protect the reef so that we can continue to gain economic value from it. The second aspect we're going to look at today is intrinsic value, and that's kind of at the opposite end of the spectrum to utility value. So we've said utility value is all about the money. We should look after the Great Barrier Reef because it gets us something in return. Intrinsic value is about something having value just because it exists, because it's pretty, because it has a spiritual value, because we think it's a nice place to go, and that's why we should look after it. And the Great Barrier Reef falls into that criteria as well. Now, intrinsic value is something that's very hard to quantify. It's very hard because it's not tangible, and everybody will have a different perspective and response to different ecosystems. So some people might look at the Great Barrier Reef and think, it's just a coral reef. I don't really see why it's important. I'm not going to bother helping to protect it. Whereas other people will look at the Great Barrier Reef and think, wow, it's gorgeous, it's really pretty to look at, or it's really important to the Indigenous people that live there, it helps to create their culture, that's why we should preserve it. And we look at this principle of inter- and intra-generational equity, which means that everybody in our generation has the same access to it, and everybody in the next generation has the same access to it. So we should protect and preserve the reef to make sure that everybody can enjoy it. Now, globally, it's recognised that the Great Barrier Reef has intrinsic value, and it was listed as a World Heritage Site in 1996 by the UNESCO organisation. And you can see that quote at the top there around the natural beauty. I'd like you to pause it for a moment and have a read of the criteria, and then we'll keep going. You can see there that UNESCO has deemed that there's many important reasons to preserve the reef, and that's why it was deemed to be a World Heritage Site, because we want to protect it for those future generations. Because it's a World Heritage Site, it means there are certain things that we can and can't do there, and that the global international community actually contribute to protecting and preserving the reef. Another aspect of that intrinsic value is around Indigenous spirituality. Particularly in Australia, we have our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, our ATSI people, which hopefully you remember from last term. They have a lot of Dreamtime stories which help them to understand how the world is created and gives them kind of a moral compass about different aspects of society. So one part of the Great Barrier Reef, there's an island called Lizard Island, and the Indigenous people of the area have a specific story around how they believe the island was formed. Can you please pause the video for a minute and have a read of the story? Okay, hopefully you can see that there is some really specific Indigenous connection to the Great Barrier Reef area, and that's another part of its intrinsic value and why we think we should protect it, to make sure that Indigenous people have access to their spirituality. The third point we're going to look at today is why biodiversity is important to ecosystem functioning. And biodiversity just refers to all the species of living things on Earth or in a specific ecosystem. We need biodiversity in order for the Earth to function. Biodiversity really just means that lots of different species coexist within an ecosystem to create that overall ecosystem. We have different levels on the food chain, and if any one of those food chain levels was removed, it would have a significant impact on that ecosystem. We as humans need ecosystems to live. We need the oxygen they produce, the nutrients they produce, the food they produce in order for us to survive. So it's really in our interest to make sure that we are protecting that biodiversity. And this is where we can talk about things like endangered animals and threatened species list to make sure that we are preserving that biodiversity. Because if we were to lose a whole species, it would significantly damage the ecosystem that species exist in. So you can see here a couple of different levels in the Great Barrier Reef when it comes to biodiversity species. So when we think about the reef, often we get stuck on corals and we just think it's full of corals, and yes, they're important, but there's lots of other species that exist on the reef as well, which you can see listed along here. We've got our sharks, we've got our squid, our fish, our starfish, sharks, whales, all sorts of things. And on the side here is a food web that kind of demonstrates how they all interact together. We have our plankton and our zooxanthellae that all the algae feed on, that then we have our shrimps feed on, that we have our fish, our bigger fish species, and then our top level predators, which we are actually part of as well. We as humans are a top level predator. Now, if we were to all of a sudden wipe out, say, this level, the water gets too hot, there's storm surges, nutrients come along, and all of a sudden there's no krill and no shrimp to eat the algae, well, we're going to have overflowing algae problems. That algae is going to cloud the water, it's going to kill the coral, but also all of a sudden there's nothing for this level of the food chain to eat, and they are going to starve and have issues further up the food chain as well. If this middle level here, perhaps, was to be overfished, which is a very possible issue on the Great Barrier Reef because we have lots of game fishing and tourists that like to go and fish these big fish, we'd have an overpopulation of this level here. And that would, again, interrupt the food chain. So making sure that there's biodiversity, that lots of species coexist together, is really important for the reef survival. The last point we're going to look at today is how human-induced climate change is impacting the Great Barrier Reef. Now, all of you should remember doing climate change from Year 9 Geography. You should remember it. Climate change is the idea of a changing climate. It's in the name. Things like temperatures rising, changes to rainfall patterns, issues like that. Specifically, we're going to look at how climate change is impacting the Great Barrier Reef. And we're going to look at human-induced climate change, because while we know that climate change is a natural process, it is increased and it is sped up by things that humans do. Things like burning fossil fuels, etc. So the three issues specifically we're going to look at for the Great Barrier Reef around climate change are ocean acidification, rising ocean temperatures, and the increase in occurrence and severity of natural disasters. And you'll need to pause this and take a few notes along the way. So rising ocean temperatures is a big issue for the Great Barrier Reef. Corals in particular need a specific temperature in order for them to survive. If water gets too warm, coral bleaching occurs and the coral essentially dies. And once that coral bleaching has happened, there's no going back. If that coral is to die, it has a flow-on effect to the biodiversity because there's no habitat for marine life to hide in, there's no food source for smaller marine creatures, and this then has an impact on its utility and intrinsic values. So we can see how all those concepts we've looked at today kind of tie together in this topic. So as climate change continues, ocean temperatures will continue to rise and put the reef at risk. The second point we're going to look at is ocean acidification. Now, ocean acidification is because of an increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We're burning fossil fuels, we're using more and more transportation that uses petroleum. That's all increasing the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. What the oceans and the seas do is act as a carbon sink, and they absorb some of that additional carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere, about 30% of it. So this is changing the pH level of the water itself. We get the creation of what's called carbonic acid, where that carbon dioxide bonds with the water and decreases the pH, making it acidic. So even really small changes in acidity can impact the coral reef negatively. It impacts the ability of corals to build their skeletons because we really need these skeletons to maintain life forms, again to provide habitats for smaller creatures and to support the corals, because each piece of new coral that is grown builds on previous parts of the reef and previous table corals. So that ocean acidity damages the skeletons, makes them weak and prone to collapse, which impacts the reef. The last one there we're going to talk about is the increase in occurrence and severity of natural disasters. This is around things like cyclones, flooding, droughts, and all of these events can bring with them fresh water and sediment, which can impact the coral stability. Think back to our first lesson on the Great Barrier Reef, and I gave you that handout with optimal coral conditions, and we know that coral is very particular. It likes to have clean water, it likes to have warm water, and any changes to that water temperature or water turbidity can impact the reef. So with climate change causing more and more severe natural disasters, that's going to have an impact. Here is an infographic that kind of puts that into visuals for you to look at all the different issues climate change can have on the reef. Now it's your turn to complete some questions. So on your Biomes worksheet, we're up to lesson 3, which means you need to complete questions 8 to 11. If you've lost your worksheet, it's on Schoolbox under the Biomes tab. You need to complete these questions on the Google Doc you set up last term, and you need to answer them in full sentences according to the line guide and the mark guide that's part of the question. Once you have finished the questions for this lesson, you need to submit done or email me done so I know that you're finished, and then I will email you the sample answers for this topic. Once you have the sample answers, you need to go back and mark your work just like we did in class last term. Be honest with how you mark it. It's only you and me that see what you give it as a mark, and these are to help you prepare for your assessment task in week 7. So it's really in your benefit to mark honestly and to mark accurately as much as you can. Once you have marked your own work, you can continue to work on your case study of your own ecosystem. I'll be around all lesson via email. If you need to get in touch, if there's any technical difficulties or you have any questions, please let me know. Enjoy.